Hey guys, tonight we are going to gently peel back the layers of legend surrounding one of history's most misunderstood figures, the Viking warrior. Picture the scene. You're standing on a misty shoreline, the salty air sharp and cold in your lungs. A longship, its prow carved into the menacing shape of a dragon's head, scrapes against the shingle of the beach. Huge, muscular figures leap into the surf, axes in hand, their faces a mask of snarling fury, and on their heads are the iconic horned helmets, glinting in the faint light. It's a powerful image, one that has been stamped into our collective imagination for centuries. It's also almost entirely wrong. And honestly, if you were dropped into their actual world with only these modern myths to guide you, you probably wouldn't survive the sheer cultural whiplash, let alone a battle. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's a quiet, no-pressure kind of channel. While you're at it, feel free to post your city and what time it is for you in the comments. It's always strangely comforting to know where everyone in our little global night owl community is tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with that helmet. It's the first and most glaring lie that Hollywood and popular culture have told us. Close your eyes for a moment and really picture it. A heavy iron bowl with two great, curving horns sweeping upwards. It looks magnificent, terrifying, and profoundly impractical. Imagine trying to fight in close quarters with that thing on your head. You'd be snagging it on every shield rim, tree branch, and low-hanging doorway from here to Constantinople. Your enemy wouldn't even need a sword. They could just grab a horn and give your neck a sharp twist. It's an ergonomic nightmare, a complete liability in a real fight. The truth is, not a single horned helmet from the Viking Age has ever been discovered by archaeologists. Not one. The helmets we have found are much more practical, functional pieces of equipment. The most famous example, the Geirmundba helmet, is the only complete one ever unearthed in Scandinavia. It's a simple, effective skullcap made of iron plates riveted together, with a spectacle-like guard protecting the eyes and nose. It's intimidating in its own stark, brutalist way, but it lacks any sort of decorative horns. So where did the myth come from? We can largely thank the romantics of the 19th century. Painters and poets, captivated by a sort of gothic, wild vision of the North, began depicting Vikings with these fantastical additions. But the idea was truly cemented in the 1870s by costume designer Carl Emil Doppler, who created horned headgear for a production of Wagner's epic opera cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen. The image was so striking, so dramatic, that it simply stuck, overriding a much plainer and more practical reality. The actual Viking warrior, if he could even afford a helmet, many likely fought with nothing more than a thick head of hair and a thicker skull, would have looked at a horned helmet with utter confusion, and perhaps a bit of pity for the poor soul who had to wear it. Now, as you're adjusting to this new, hornless image of a Norse warrior, let's address another pervasive myth, the idea that they were filthy, matted hair barbarians. This, too, is a bit of a historical smear campaign, likely spread by the people they were frequently raiding, who understandably weren't their biggest fans. The archaeological record tells a very, very different story. In fact, among the most common items found in Viking Age graves, for both men and women, are grooming tools. Exquisitely carved combs made of antler or bone are almost ubiquitous. Think about that. These are people who valued their combs so much they wanted to be buried with them for the afterlife. You don't carry a comb into eternity if you're not deeply concerned with your hair on a daily basis. But it wasn't just combs. Tiny, delicate tweezers, nail cleaners, and even miniature ear spoons for removing wax have been found, often strung together in a personal grooming kit that a person would hang from their belt. Imagine our imposing, axe-wielding warrior, fresh from the beach, reaching not for a drinking horn of mead, but for his trusty ear spoon. It's a bit of a different vibe, isn't it? English chroniclers from the period actually complained about the Vikings' surprisingly foppish habits. One 13th century text laments that Norsemen were so popular with English noblewomen because they combed their hair daily, bathed every Saturday, and changed their clothes regularly. They were apparently clean, well-dressed, and smelled better than the locals. They were undermining the social fabric of England not just with axes, but with soap. That's some next-level psychological warfare. And what were they wearing while they were so busy being clean? Forget the drab, shapeless leather and fur ensembles you see in television shows. Vikings loved color. They were masters of creating dyes from the plants around them. weld for yellow, woad for blue, and madder root for a vibrant red. A high-status Viking's cloak wouldn't be a dull brown bearskin. It might be a rich, scarlet wool, or a deep indigo linen, fastened at the shoulder with an ornate, gilded brooch. These brooches weren't just functional. They were complex pieces of art, decorated with intricate knotwork and animal motifs that spoke to a sophisticated visual language we are still working to fully understand. They wore jewelry, rings, necklaces made of glass beads and silver, and elaborate arm rings that served as a kind of wearable bank account, easily clipped apart to pay for goods and services. Historians still argue about the precise social meanings of different clothing colors and jewelry styles. Did a certain brooch design signify your allegiance to a particular chieftain, or did the color blue mean you were a successful merchant? The evidence is often just rich enough to tantalize us with possibilities, but not quite clear enough to give us firm answers. So let's adjust that mental picture one more time. You are on that misty English shore. The longship arrives, but this time, the man who steps into the water has a smooth, clean-shaven neck and a neatly combed, possibly braided beard. His helmet is a simple iron bowl, functional and unadorned. His tunic is a surprising flash of color against the gray sky, rich blue perhaps, and his heavy wool cloak is held in place by a stunningly complex silver brooch that glitters with polished perfection. He is carrying an axe, yes, but he is also carrying a comb. He is not a monster from a fever dream. He is a man who took the time this morning to make sure he looked presentable before heading off to a long day of Viking activities. It's a far cry from the brutish caricature, and it hints at a culture of surprising vanity and self-care, a world where looking good and fighting well were perhaps not mutually exclusive pursuits at all. Now you have this reformed image of our visitor on the shore. He is clean, fashionable, and surprisingly conscious of his appearance. He is ready for a fight, certainly, but he's not a one-dimensional monster. And this brings us to the next, and perhaps even bigger, lie. The idea that Viking was a people and ethnicity, a label you were born with. You often hear phrases like the Vikings invaded, or the Viking people. But you would never hear an old Norseman say, I am a Viking. He would say he was a Norseman, a Dane, a Swede, a Norwegian. He might identify himself by his hometown, his farm, his father's name. The word Viking isn't a noun for a person in that way. It's more of a verb, an activity. In Old Norse, to go Viking meant to go on an expedition, usually overseas. It was a job description, not a national identity. Think of it less like being an Englishman and more like being a prospector or a deep-sea fisher. It's something you do, often for a limited time, usually when you're young, ambitious, and perhaps a little bit foolish. Our well-dressed man on the beach. For 10 months of the year, he was probably something else entirely. He was a farmer. Let's leave the misty English coast behind for a moment and travel back with him, back to his home in Norway. Let's imagine what his everyday life truly looked like. You would find him not in a chaotic, battle-strewn encampment, but on a farm, a guard, likely nestled in a fjord where the mountains plunge dramatically into the sea. The central point of his world is the longhouse. Step inside. Your eyes take a moment to adjust to the gloom. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke from the long, open fire pit that runs down the center of the building, a smell that clings to the heavy wool of your clothes. There's also the faint, earthy aroma of livestock, as the family's most precious animals are often brought inside to share the space and the warmth during the brutal winter months. This is not a life of constant adventure. It is a life of grinding, repetitive, essential work. You wake before the sun. In the summer, you guide a simple wooden plow, an ard, pulled by a pair of oxen, to break up the thin, rocky soil to plant barley, oats, and rye. You worry about the weather, a late frost, a summer drought. You help bring in the hay that will hopefully see your cattle through the long, dark winter. You mend fences, repair tools, and muck out the byre. In the autumn, you join the others in the hard, bloody work of slaughtering the animals that cannot be fed until the spring. Every single task is bent towards one single purpose, survival. This farmer, this Norseman, looked at the world with pragmatic eyes. He knew that the land could only support so many people. As his sons grew up, they would need land of their own, and there simply wasn't enough to go around. So, what do you do when you are a young man with no inheritance to look forward to? No farm of your own on the horizon. You need to make a name for yourself. You need to build up some wealth, what they called fey, a word that meant both cattle and money, showing you just how tied to the land their concept of wealth was. And this is where the Viking part comes in. Going on a raid was a business venture. A high-risk, high-reward, seasonal occupation. In the spring, after the crops were planted, a local chieftain might announce he was gathering a crew for a summer expedition. This was your chance. You and the other young men of the district, farmers and sons of farmers, would haul the longship from its shed, patch its hull, tar its timbers, and prepare for the voyage. For a few months, you would trade the plow for an oar, the sickle for a spear. You would become a Viking. Historians still debate the precise scope of the term Viking in its original Norse context. Some argue it always implied raiding and piracy, while others suggest it could also refer to more peaceful, long-distance trading expeditions. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, and it probably depended on the opportunities that presented themselves once you were far from home. The goal wasn't just mindless destruction. The goal was portable wealth. Gold and silver from monasteries, yes, but also other things. Fine fabrics, glass, wine, weapons, and people. The slave trade was a brutal but significant part of the Viking economy. These things could be brought back home and used to buy the one thing that truly mattered, land. Or perhaps it would allow you to establish yourself as a trader, because raiding was only one of the overseas activities the Norse engaged in. They were also phenomenal merchants. Our young farmer might not go raiding at all. He might load his share of the ship with things his community produced: soapstone for bowls, iron bars forged from bog iron, warm woolen cloaks, maybe even walrus ivory or falcons captured in the northern wilderness. He would then sail not to England to raid, but east, across the Baltic, navigating the vast network of Russian rivers. He would be part of a trading caravan, hauling his ship over land on log rollers between river systems, traveling for weeks or months until he reached the great, glittering markets of the Byzantine Empire or the Abbasid Caliphate. There, he would trade his northern goods for silk, spices, and silver coins, dirhams, stamped with Arabic script, which have been found in the thousands all across Scandinavia. This was the other side of the Viking coin. Less bloody, but no less arduous. They were just as much entrepreneurs as they were warriors, connecting the entire known world in a web of commerce. So, the man you see in your mind's eye is not just a raider. He's a farmer, an aspiring landowner, perhaps a merchant. He is part of a complex and dynamic society, not a roaming band of killers. His violence, when it occurred, was often purposeful, a means to an end in a harsh and unforgiving world. His life was defined not by the singular act of raiding, but by the relentless cycle of the seasons, by the demands of his farm and family, and by the powerful, ever-present desire to build a better life for himself, whether by the plow, the merchant's scale, or, for a few short, brutal summers, the axe. So, our Norseman is a complex figure. He's a farmer for most of the year, perhaps a long-distance trader with an eye for exotic goods. But we have to face the fact that, for a few months in the summer, he takes up that axe for a reason. He goes Viking. And this is where the image of the savage, bloodthirsty berserker really takes root in our minds. It's an image built on a foundation of genuine fear and violence. There is no sense in pretending otherwise. The Viking raids were terrifying experiences for their victims. But to truly understand it, we need to put that brutality in its proper context, to see it not as a unique brand of evil, but as a feature of a universally violent age. The event that really kicks off the Viking Age and cements their terrifying reputation is the raid on the holy island of Lindisfarne in Northumbria, off the coast of England, in the year 793. Let's put you there for a moment. You are a monk in this small, isolated, and profoundly holy place. Your life is a quiet rhythm of prayer, manuscript illumination, and contemplation. Your world is one of bells, chants, and the cries of seabirds. It is famously wealthy, a repository of gold chalices, jeweled crosses, and richly embroidered vestments, gifts from pious kings and nobles. But more than that, it is unprotected. It has never needed to be. Who would dare to desecrate such a holy sanctuary? And then, one day, the dragon ships appear on the horizon. Out of nowhere. There is no warning. For you, these men who storm ashore are like a punishment from God himself. They are pagans, heathens who do not respect the sanctity of your church. They move with a speed and ferocity you have never witnessed. They are not interested in a battle. They are interested in treasure. They smash, they grab, they kill those who stand in their way, and then as quickly as they came, they are gone, leaving behind smoke, terror, and sacrilege. The scholar Alcuin of York, writing from the distant court of Charlemagne, captured the shock that rippled through Christendom. Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar, and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. It's powerful stuff. And it's an excellent piece of public relations for the victims. This account, and others like it, written by churchmen who were the primary targets and the only literate chroniclers of the age, framed the narrative for the next 1,000 years. The Vikings were demonic, mindless destroyers. The problem is, this picture is woefully incomplete. It lacks context. Was their violence exceptional? Let's look at one of the most powerful and civilized rulers of the era, the very same Charlemagne in whose court Alcuin was writing. Charlemagne was a devout Christian king, the great unifier of Europe. He was also responsible for things like the massacre of Verdun in 782, where he ordered the beheading of 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day because they had rebelled against his rule and his forced Christianization of their lands. It was a calculated act of political terror, on a scale far exceeding almost any recorded Viking raid. The key difference? Charlemagne had monks on his payroll. His historians wrote about his great deeds, his piety, his unification of the Frankish Empire. The massacre was framed as a just, if harsh, necessity. The Vikings, on the other hand, had their history written exclusively by their enemies. Imagine if the only accounts of the Roman Empire were written by Carthaginian survivors or rebellious Celtic tribes. You'd get a very different, and likely very monstrous, picture of a Roman legionary. The Vikings weren't playing by different rules. They were simply playing on a different team, and their opponents were the ones keeping score. Their violence was often a tool, a tactic. The shock and awe of the Lindisfarne raid was its greatest weapon. By appearing suddenly, striking a soft and revered target, and disappearing, they sent a message: nowhere is safe. It was psychological warfare. This reputation for ferocity became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more terrifying you seemed, the less likely people were to resist you, and the faster you could get the job done and sail away before a local lord could muster his army. And speaking of that ferocity, we must address the most infamous and theatrical example of Viking brutality, the blood eagle. The accounts in later sagas describe a horrifying ritual execution where a victim's ribs were severed from their spine and their lungs pulled out through the openings, creating a shape that vaguely resembled a pair of bloody wings. It is the absolute pinnacle of Viking savagery in popular culture. It's also something that historians are now deeply skeptical about. Historians still argue whether the blood eagle was a genuine ritualistic execution or a later, gruesome literary invention. The descriptions are vague, appear only in a couple of poetic sources written hundreds of years after the Viking Age, and could very well be the result of a Christian author's attempt to paint the old pagans in the most devilish light possible, or even just a simple misinterpretation of a complex piece of poetry. There's no archaeological evidence for it whatsoever. It seems more likely to be a piece of macabre fiction, a horror story told about the heathens, than an actual practiced reality. It's like believing every monster described in a medieval bestiary was a real animal. Sometimes a story is just a story, meant to make your enemies seem truly monstrous. The truth of their violence was likely more mundane, more pragmatic. It was the swift, efficient violence of the mugger, not the elaborate cruelty of the serial killer. The goal was to acquire fey, that portable wealth we talked about, to go on a summer trip and come back rich enough to buy land, get married, and settle down. It was a brutal means to a comfortable, domestic end. So yes, you see fear and you see smoke when the longships arrive. The terror of the monk at Lindisfarne is real and valid. But if you could pull the camera back to a God's eye view of the 9th century, you would see that the whole map is covered in smoke. From Charlemagne's campaigns in Saxony, to internecine warfare between Anglo-Saxon kings, to Magyar raids in the east and Umayyad campaigns in Spain, it was a world steeped in violence. The Norsemen were not a unique aberration. They were simply the scary new players who had just entered the game, and they were very, very good at making an unforgettable first impression. And so we have this pragmatic farmer-turned-raider, whose violence, while terrifying, was a product of his time, a tool for social and economic advancement. Now let's get into the specifics of that toolkit. Let's look at the actual objects he would hold in his hands when he stepped ashore, and here, once again, we find that reality is much simpler, and in some ways more interesting than the fantasy. Forget the image of every Viking warrior wielding a massive, double-bit battle axe or a shimmering, flawless broadsword. That's a video game inventory. The single most common weapon of the Viking Age was not the axe, and it certainly wasn't the sword. It was the humble spear. You should picture a simple shaft of ash wood, 6 to 8 feet long, tipped with a leaf-shaped blade of iron. It was cheap to make, requiring far less precious iron than a sword, and it was incredibly versatile. You could use it in formation, creating a bristling shield wall with your comrades. You could throw it. You could use its length to keep a swordsman at a distance. The spear was the great equalizer on the battlefield. It was the rifle of its day, common, effective, and accessible to the average person. Our farmer likely owned a spear long before he ever thought of going on a raid. It would have been a useful tool for hunting back home. His secondary weapon, his sidearm, would indeed have been an axe. But not the monstrous, two-handed fantasy weapon you're imagining. It would have been a smaller, single-handed axe. Many of them were quite elegant in their design, with a long, sweeping bearded blade where the bottom edge curves down. This beard was useful. It created a wider cutting surface, and a skilled fighter could use the hook to pull at an enemy's shield or leg. But what's most telling is that these axes are often indistinguishable from a common wood-cutting axe. Remember our farmer? The same tool he used to fell a tree or split firewood back at the longhouse could, with a bit of sharpening and a steady hand, serve him perfectly well in a fight. It's the very definition of a multi-purpose tool, which should tell you a lot about the pragmatic mindset of its owner. You don't need two axes if one can do the job of both chopping down a tree and, well, chopping down something else. The sword was different. A sword was a status symbol. It was the equivalent of a nobleman's limousine or a collector's supercar. The amount of iron and charcoal needed to forge one, and the skill required of the smith, made it incredibly expensive. An ordinary farmer or raider would likely never touch one. These belonged to the chieftains, the jarls, the wealthy elite. And they were magnificent. The finest blades were pattern welded, a technique where the smith would take multiple rods of iron with different properties, twist them together like candy canes, and then forge them flat. This process, which left stunning, watery patterns on the surface of the finished blade, created a weapon that was both hard enough to hold an edge and flexible enough not to shatter on impact. The hilts were often lavished with silver wire inlay and intricate bronze carvings. A man's sword had a name, Legbiter or Sea King's Flame, and it would be passed down through generations, an heirloom that carried the history and honor of a family. To own a sword was to declare to the world that you were someone of importance. As for protection, you can forget about shining suits of plate armor. That comes much later in the Middle Ages. The vast majority of Viking fighters went into battle wearing nothing more than their everyday woolen tunic and a surplus of courage. Some might have had a thick, padded leather jacket, a gambeson, which could help absorb the shock of a blow. Only the wealthiest leader, the same man who owned the fancy sword, could afford a mail shirt, a byrnie. Each byrnie was made from thousands of tiny, interlinked iron rings, each one individually riveted shut. The amount of labor was staggering. A single mail shirt could cost more than a small farm. It was the absolute pinnacle of personal defense, and it was fantastically rare. So, the average warrior's primary defense was his shield. And this is an object worth lingering on. Picture a round shield, about a meter across, made of wooden planks glued together. In the center is a domed piece of iron, the shield boss, which protects the hand that grips a bar directly behind it. The face of the shield was often covered in leather and painted, sometimes in bright colors or bold geometric patterns. Like the colorful clothes, the shield was another canvas for personal expression. And it wasn't a passive piece of equipment. You didn't just hide behind it. You used it as a weapon. You could punch with the central boss. You could slam the rim into an opponent's face. You could use its broad surface to shove and create openings. A close-quarters fight in the Viking Age was probably less a ballet of clashing swords and more a brutal scrum of shoving, punching, and frantic stabbing with spears and axes around the edges of locked shields. This focus on the shield, this iconic piece of defense, brings us quite neatly to one of the most exciting and contentious topics in the entire study of the Norse world, the shield maiden, the skjoldmo, a woman who took up the shield and the sword to fight alongside men. For many, she is a powerful, inspiring figure, and she appears frequently in the later sagas and poems. Mythic figures like Brynhildur the Valkyrie or the fierce Hervaer, who brandishes her ancestral sword. For a long time, historians treated these figures as just that, literary myths. Tales of fantasy, not history. Then came a truly fascinating discovery. A spectacular warrior's grave, known as BJ 581, was excavated in the 1880s at a major Viking trading town called Birka in modern-day Sweden. The grave was packed with the signs of a high-status warrior. It contained a sword, an axe, a spear, arrows, and the remains of 2 horses. The individual was buried sitting up, with a board game, a strategic war game, laid across their lap. For more than a century, this grave was held up as the textbook example of a professional Viking warrior, a chieftain, a man, until 2017, when a DNA analysis was performed on the skeleton. The bones, which had told a story of a powerful man for over 100 years, were conclusively shown to belong to a biological female. This sent shockwaves through the historical community. Here, it seemed, was the proof. A shield maiden, real and tangible, no longer a myth. But as tantalizing as this is, we must tread carefully. Historians still argue whether the woman in grave BJ 581 was a battlefield commander, a ritual leader, or something else entirely. The presence of weapons in a grave does not automatically equate to a warrior's life, especially in a culture so rich with symbolism. Could she have been a powerful seer or noble woman, buried with the symbols of authority and military might, rather than having wielded them herself? It's a debate that pits archaeology and science against the deep-seated cultural narratives we want to believe. It is a perfect example of how history is a constant conversation, always reevaluating itself in the face of new evidence. The truth is, the Burqa warrior is, for now, an outlier. A quirky, incredible, mind-bending tidbit that makes us question our assumptions, but one is not enough to rewrite the whole book. We haven't found a whole host of other female graves filled with weapons. So, while the idea of a fierce shield maiden charging into the fray is a thrilling one, and while the Burqa woman shows us that female power in the Viking world could take forms we are only just beginning to understand, the average Norseman probably didn't fight alongside women. His battle brothers were other farmers, other ambitious young men. The world of Norse women was centered on other domains of power, running the longhouse while the men were away, managing the farm's resources, holding the keys to the stores of food, practicing textile arts, and navigating a legal system that, surprisingly, gave them rights to own property and even initiate divorce. Her power was real, just practiced in a different arena than the shield wall. So let's leave the battlefield behind you now. Leave the clashing shields and the grim, businesslike axes. The world of the Norsemen was so much larger than a single summer of raiding. Let's step back onto the deck of his magnificent longship. But this time, you aren't looking for a coastline to plunder. You're looking for a new horizon. The true legacy of these people is written not just in the blood they spilled, but in the waves they crossed. Forget the warrior for a moment, and let's meet the explorer. These were, without question, the finest mariners of their age. Their ships were masterpieces of naval engineering, long, flexible, with a shallow draft that allowed them to sail up rivers just as easily as they crossed the open ocean. And they sailed into the unknown with a courage that is difficult to comprehend. How did you navigate the vast, featureless expanse of the North Atlantic? You had no GPS, no satellite phone. You had your senses, honed to a razor's edge. You watched the flight of seabirds, knowing they would lead you to land. You noted the changing color and temperature of the water. On a clear day, you might have used a sun compass to track your east-west position. On a cloudy day, legend speaks of the Solarstein, a sunstone, likely a type of crystal like calcite, that could reveal the sun's position even through thick cloud cover by polarizing the light. Imagine yourself on that ship, tasting the salt spray. Your destination isn't a monastery full of gold, but an idea, a rumor of land to the west where there are no kings and no taxes. Following this rumor, or perhaps just blown off course, Norse sailors in the late 9th century found Iceland. It was an empty land, a rugged, volcanic island of ice and fire. And for people feeling squeezed by powerful, centralizing kings back in Norway, it was a blank slate. It was freedom. They packed their families, their livestock, and their few precious belongings into those ships and sailed west to build a new society from scratch. But they didn't stop there. From Iceland, a particularly hot-tempered chieftain named Eric the Red, exiled for what the sagas politely call some killings, sailed further west and found an even larger landmass. He returned to Iceland to recruit settlers for his new discovery, and here we see that even a legendary Norseman knew the value of good marketing. He called this vast, forbidding sheet of ice Greenland. It's one of history's first and most audacious real estate scams. It wasn't exactly green, but the name was just enticing enough to convince a few thousand settlers to follow him. And for nearly 500 years they survived there, a tiny outpost of Europe on the edge of the Arctic world. And then, from Greenland, around the year 1000, Eric's own son, a man named Leif Erikson, led an expedition even further west, landing on the shores of what is now Newfoundland in Canada. He landed in North America almost 500 years before Columbus was even born. They found a land of timber, salmon-choked rivers, and wild grapes, which led them to call it Vinland, the land of wine or vines. They tried to build a settlement, the remains of which we have found at L'Anse aux Meadows. But they were not alone. They encountered the indigenous inhabitants, whom they called Skraelingjar. Their relations were tense, sometimes violent. And after a few short years, the Norse abandoned their North American dream. Scholars still debate the exact reasons why. Was it the hostility of the native population? The vast distance from home? A changing climate? The Viking Age reached the New World, touched it, and then, for reasons we may never fully know, it receded. This same restless energy, this drive to create and explore, wasn't just channeled into geography, it was also poured into their art. If you could zoom in from the grand map of their voyages to the small objects they held in their hands, you would find a world of dizzying complexity. We have this idea of their art as crude or primitive, but it's anything but. Look at a piece of their jewelry, or the carving on a rune stone. You see looping, endless knotwork. You see what archaeologists call the gripping beast motif, where animals, wolves, snakes, dragons, bite and claw at their own bodies or at the creatures tangled around them. It's a style that is energetic, alive, and almost seems to squirm before your eyes. It requires an incredible precision and forethought to carve something so intricate into a piece of wood or metal. You'd think a person steady enough to master the style of art, with its slender, interwoven animal forms, would be the last person to get into a shield wall scuffle. It's like finding out your heavy metal drummer is also a world-class neurosurgeon. And this leads us to the final, and perhaps most profound, lie to dismantle: the notion that these were lawless savages. The opposite is true. The Norse were obsessed with law. It was the bedrock of their society. In Iceland, the new society they built had no king. Instead, their society was governed by the Alþingi, or the Alting, an annual outdoor assembly of all the free people of the nation. It's one of the oldest surviving parliaments in the world. Picture it. You're not in a grand hall, but gathered in a natural lava rock amphitheater under the open sky. Here, any free man could bring his grievances. You didn't just fight someone you had a dispute with, you prosecuted them in court. Their legal code was fantastically complex, covering everything from land boundaries to inheritance, from boat-building regulations to insults. Honor was a tangible thing you could defend in court. Calling someone a coward, or implying they were unmanly, could result in a fine. This wasn't chaos, it was an intricately ordered world. And at the heart of this assembly was a figure known as the law speaker. Because this was a largely pre-literate society for a time, this person's job was to memorize the entire legal code and recite 1/3 of it from memory at the Alting each year, over a 3-year cycle. He was a walking, talking legal hard drive. Imagine the pressure of that job. Forgetting a line or two wouldn't just be embarrassing. You could accidentally abolish the inheritance laws for a week. This deep respect for law, for process, for community judgment, is the absolute antithesis of the pop culture Viking, who solves every problem with an axe. So, as we bring our journey to a close tonight, let's look one last time at the man who stepped ashore at Lindisfarne. Yes, he carried an axe. Yes, his arrival meant terror for the monks. But he was not just the sum of that single violent act. He was a part of a culture that groomed itself with care, that wore vibrant colors, and that valued a well-made brooch. He came from a world of hard-working farmers and ambitious merchants. He was a brother to the men and women who, using little more than wood, wool, and wits, would go on to explore and map more of the world than any people before them. And he was a citizen of a society so devoted to law and order that its greatest hero wasn't a king, but a man who could simply remember the rules. The screaming warrior with the horned helmet is a lie. The truth is quieter, calmer, and infinitely more interesting. He is an explorer, an artist, a lawmaker, a farmer, a human being. A man who was part of a complex and brilliant world that is now, finally, still. And perhaps now it's time for you to be still too. The single rule that broke Victorian society. We need to talk about the law that underpinned this entire silent, orderly world. It wasn't passed in Parliament. It wasn't written down in any constitution. There was no police force to enforce it, yet it was more powerful, more pervasive, and more merciless than any formal statute. It was the unwritten law of respectability. Respectability wasn't just about being a good person. It was about appearing to be a good person at all times, without a single crack in the facade. It was the great social obsession of the 19th century, the currency that bought you a place in society. You could be enormously wealthy, an aristocrat with a lineage stretching back to the Norman conquest. But if you lacked respectability, the doors of the new, powerful middle-class society would be quietly but firmly closed to you. And if you were poor, achieving even a sliver of respectability was your only hope of ever clawing your way up from the gutter. It was everything. But what was it? You feel its presence everywhere. It is in the stiff, tightly laced corset that restricts your every breath, enforcing a ramrod-straight posture of moral rectitude. It's in the dark, heavy fabrics of your clothes, chosen to communicate sobriety and seriousness. It's in the sheer, oppressive clutter of a parlor, every surface covered with objects, figurines, ferns, framed portraits, each one a silent testament to your family's stability and good taste. There is no empty space, just as there can be no empty time. Idleness was a sin, a gateway to unrespectable thoughts and habits. This obsession was a relatively new phenomenon, born out of the massive social shifts of the Industrial Revolution. A powerful new middle class, factory owners, merchants, clerks, was emerging, and they needed a way to define themselves. They looked up at the old aristocracy and saw decadence, gambling, and loose morals. They looked down at the working classes and saw drunkenness, grime, and chaos. Respectability, then, became their armor and their banner. It was built on the pillars of financial stability, religious piety, specifically a brand of earnest evangelical Protestantism, and above all, the control of one's emotions and impulses. To be respectable was to be the master of your own inner world, allowing nothing spontaneous, passionate, or messy to escape into public view. It governed conversation. You never spoke of money, it was considered vulgar. You certainly never spoke about the body or anything related to physical intimacy. To do so would be social suicide. This is the era that gave us the now debunked but perfectly illustrative myth of people covering the legs of their pianos with little trousers, lest they incite improper thoughts. While it's just a funny story, it captures the spirit of the anxiety perfectly. The sheer mental energy required to navigate a simple conversation was immense, a constant game of avoiding verbal tripwires that could instantly reveal you as someone who, well, wasn't quite the right sort. To manage this complex social world, an entire, intricate system of rules emerged. Take, for example, the simple act of visiting someone. You couldn't just drop by. The whole affair was stage-managed through the use of visiting cards. A gentleman's card was small and plain. A lady's was larger and more ornate. Upon arriving at a house, you would hand your card to the servant at the door. You didn't hand it to the lady of the house herself, of course. That would be far too forward. You would then wait to see if you were admitted. A whole silent conversation could be had just with these cards. Turning down one corner of the card could signify that you came in person, rather than sending a servant. A different fold could signal condolences or congratulations. Historians still argue whether the complexity of this etiquette was a genuine attempt at refined social grace or simply a mechanism of exclusion, a set of secret handshakes designed to instantly identify outsiders who didn't know the code. This constant performance was exhausting. You were on stage from the moment you woke up to the moment you went to sleep. Your neighbors watched. Your servants watched. Everyone was a critic, and the stakes were impossibly high. Because to lose your respectability was to become a social ghost. It was to be ruined. And ruin meant losing your friends, your credit, your marriage prospects, your entire place in the world. It was a kind of living death. For this single, unwritten rule didn't just ask you to be good. It asked you to be perfect. And it offered absolutely no forgiveness if you failed. It created a society terrified of its own shadow, one where the most important thing wasn't what you did, but what people thought you did. And that terror, that constant grinding pressure to maintain a flawless public performance, would begin to warp the very soul of the society it was meant to protect, twisting it into some very strange and very dark shapes. This suffocating, unwritten law of respectability needed a space to live, an architecture to contain it. You couldn't just be respectable in the abstract. You had to perform it within a carefully constructed stage set. And so Victorian society was neatly and ruthlessly divided into two separate, sacred realms. This division, which historians call the doctrine of separate spheres, became the very blueprint for the respectable family, the load-bearing wall of the entire social edifice. Let's imagine you are a man of the house, a mid-level clerk in the city of London. It is morning. You stand in your hallway. your wife handing you your hat and gloves. When you open that heavy front door, with its polished brass knob that we remember, you are stepping out of one world and into another. You step into the public sphere. This is the domain of men. It is a world of work, politics, commerce, and competition. It's the world of the fog, the grime, the clatter of carts, the shouting of newsboys, the raw, striving energy of empire and industry. It's also seen as a place of moral compromise and spiritual danger. To succeed out there, you have to be ambitious, competitive, maybe even a little ruthless. The public sphere is a battlefield, and it will tarnish you. Then, at the end of the day, you return. You place your hand on that same doorknob, and you cross the threshold back into the private sphere. This is the domain of women, the home. And it is not just a building. It is meant to be a kind of spiritual fortress, a sanctuary from the grimy, corrupting influence of the outside world. And the keeper of this sanctuary, the person whose entire existence is dedicated to maintaining its purity and peace, is your wife. She is the angel in the house, a phrase made famous by a hugely popular poem of the era. Her job description, if you could call it that, was to be the moral and emotional core of the family, to be pure, pious, gentle, and utterly selfless. Her role was to soothe your weary, world-stained soul. The air inside the home is supposed to be different. The scent of polish and potpourri replaces the coal smoke of the street. The chaotic noise of commerce is replaced by the quiet ticking of the mantel clock, or perhaps, the sound of her playing a gentle melody on the piano, one of the required accomplishments for a middle-class lady. It wasn't vital that she played well, mind you, only that she could demonstrate she'd had the leisure time to learn. She is the human equivalent of all those ferns and figurines in the parlor, decorative, calming, and a testament to your success. You earned enough money so that she didn't have to. Her very idleness was the ultimate status symbol. This, at least, was the ideal. This was the dollhouse dream of Victorian respectability. A perfect man providing for a perfect woman in a perfect home, a fortress of morality in a wicked world. The problem, of course, is that it was almost entirely a fantasy. For the vast majority of people, this blueprint was an impossible and often cruel joke. Let's step out of that comfortable middle-class parlor for a moment and walk down the street, and then down another, and another, into the sprawling, impoverished neighborhoods of the East End. Here, for millions of working-class women, the idea of a separate sphere was pure nonsense. They couldn't afford to be angels. They had to be workers. A woman might spend 14 hours a day hunched over in the toxic fumes of a match factory, her jaw literally at risk of rotting away from phosphorus poisoning. She might work as a seamstress in a cramped, freezing attic, stitching elaborate dresses for wealthy women she would never meet, her eyesight failing in the flickering gaslight. The single largest employer of women, however, was domestic service. Here, a young woman might live in the very house of the angel, but her reality was a world away. She was up before dawn to light the fires, and she collapsed into bed long after the family was asleep, living a life of grueling, invisible labor. For these women, the public and private spheres weren't separate at all. They were brutally, exhaustingly intertwined. They were forced to labor in the masculine world of work precisely so they could keep their own tiny rented room, their private sphere, from falling apart. But even for the women who seemingly achieved the ideal, the middle-class angels in their lovely houses, the reality could be a gilded cage. You are that angel. What do you do all day? You wake up. You instruct the servants on the meals for the day. You check that the dusting has been done. You might write a few letters, do some embroidery, practice the piano. But you produce nothing. You engage with no one outside your small, approved social circle. Your education was designed to make you an interesting, but not too challenging, companion for a husband, not to fill your mind with ambition or independent thought. The result, for many, was a profound sense of boredom, depression, and uselessness. This era saw a curious epidemic among middle-class women of vague, chronic illnesses, constant fatigue, fainting spells, nervous conditions, all bundled under the catch-all diagnosis of hysteria. This gave rise to the quirky cultural tidbit of the cult of the invalid. It became almost fashionable to be delicate and sickly. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine psychological crisis brought on by a deeply unsatisfying existence or a subconscious, socially acceptable form of protest. If your only role is to be decorative and passive, then becoming a beautiful, tragic invalid is perhaps the most perfect expression of that role, one of the few ways you could command attention and exert some control over your environment. The pressure wasn't just on the women. The man in this equation was tasked with being the sole, unerring provider. In a volatile new industrial economy prone to booms and busts, this was a terrifying prospect. Business failure wasn't just a financial disaster, it was a moral failing. It meant you had failed to protect your home, failed to keep your angel safe in her sanctuary. The stress was immense, driving men to work themselves into an early grave, or to seek release in the very unrespectable worlds of gambling, drinking, and secret affairs that they were supposed to be shielded from. So, you see the tension. The entire system of respectability rested on this idea of the perfectly ordered home, with the man as the bridge to the outside world and the woman as its perfect passive soul. But it was a house of cards. It was a standard almost no one could meet, and the strain of pretending, the immense collective effort to keep the dollhouse looking perfect from the outside, created a society brimming with secrets. The pressure was building, and it's what happened when that pressure found a release, when the cracks began to show, that we see the true, brutal cost of this single, simple rule. That perfect dollhouse, with its silent, orderly rooms, begins to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. The pressure is immense. The silence is deafening, and a structure under this much constant, unrelenting strain is bound to develop cracks. It's what seeps through those cracks in the dead of night, when the rest of the world is asleep, that reveals the truth. The single rule of respectability didn't eliminate sin or chaos. It just drove it underground and made it a secret. Let's follow that same middle-class man, the clerk who stepped so bravely into the public sphere each morning. You walk with him on his way home. But tonight, instead of turning toward his own polished front door, you see him hesitate under the fuzzy glow of a gas lamp. He glances over his shoulder, straightens his hat, and then turns, almost guiltily, down a side street. You follow him as he plunges into a different London. Here, the fog doesn't seem to muffle the sounds. It seems to trap them. The raucous, tinny music of a piano spills out of a tavern door. Laughter, louder and harsher than anything you would hear in a respectable parlor, echoes from a brightly lit gin palace. This is the Victorian underworld, the city's secret, shameful other half. And it thrived. For every rule of respectability, this world offered a release. Was your home life a theater of quiet, controlled emotion? Here, in the music halls, you could sing along to bawdy songs and watch comedians tell jokes that would make your wife faint. Were you supposed to be sober and frugal? Here, cheap gin could blur the sharp edges of your anxieties about work and money. The sheer number of men who sought out these secret lives shows how unbearable the pressure of the perfect life could be. It was a pressure valve, a necessary hypocrisy to keep the boiler of society from exploding entirely. He might spend an hour or two here, indulging in everything he was supposed to shun, before recomposing his face, brushing down his coat, and heading home to his angel, ready to play his part as the virtuous patriarch once more. It must have required a kind of mental acrobatics, a color-coded planner for your soul, just to keep track of who you were supposed to be from one street to the next. But this secret life had a much darker dimension, and it centered around what contemporaries called the great social evil. It's the flip side of that perfect, pure angel in the house. If she represented the absolute pinnacle of female virtue, her dark twin was the fallen woman. She was the ghost at the respectable banquet, the human cost of this unforgiving system. Who is a fallen woman? You are in her shoes now. Perhaps you were a servant, seduced and abandoned by your employer's son. Perhaps your husband died, leaving you with children and no means of support in a world where respectable jobs for women were nearly non-existent. Or perhaps, just once, you broke the ironclad rules of courtship, were seen unchaperoned with a man, and a whisper of scandal destroyed your reputation. That's all it took. The moment you are branded fallen, every door of the respectable world slams shut. Your family disowns you, not out of malice, but out of a terrified sense of self-preservation. Your ruin could taint them all. The polished doorknob of your own home, which we remember as a symbol of pride, is now cold and unmoving. You are cast out. With no family, no references, and no character to speak of, what can you do? For tens of thousands of women, the only path away from starvation was prostitution. They became the secret women for the secret lives of those respectable men. This was the central hypocrisy of the age. A man could visit a brothel, release his anxieties, and then walk home, re-entering his respectable sphere with his status intact. His transgression was secret, temporary, forgivable. For the woman, there was no walking home. Her fall was total and permanent. This hypocrisy was literally written into law. You can see it in a mainstream and very strange series of acts called the Contagious Diseases Acts, passed in the 1860s. The quirky and frankly horrifying tidbit is that these laws gave police in certain garrison towns the right to arrest any woman they merely suspected of being a prostitute. They could then subject her to a brutal, compulsory medical examination. If she was found to have a venereal disease, she could be locked away in a hospital for months. The male clients? They faced no examination, no regulation, no punishment at all. The entire burden of the social evil, its physical and its moral consequences, was placed squarely on the shoulders of its most desperate victims. In the face of this social catastrophe, a rescue movement arose, led largely by evangelical Christians. They established homes and Magdalene laundries for fallen women, offering them a path back, not to respectability, that was gone forever, but to a life of piety and penitence. Historians still argue about the true nature of these rescue homes. Were they genuine havens of compassion, or were they simply another form of prison, enforcing conformity under the guise of piety? You picture yourself being rescued. You're given a plain, drab uniform, your name might be changed, and you spend your days in hard, unpaid labor, endlessly washing laundry while listening to sermons about your own wickedness. For some, it may have been a sincere relief. For others, it was simply swapping one kind of cage for another. The sheer joy of it all. This character of the fallen woman haunted the Victorian imagination. She appears everywhere in their novels and art, a beautiful, tragic figure, often freezing in the snow, gazing longingly through a window at the happy family she can never rejoin. She served as a constant, terrifying warning to every woman in England. This is what happens when you break the rule. This is the cost of a single misstep. This world had no safety nets, offered no second chances. And this profound, heartbreaking cruelty, this willingness to discard human lives to maintain a flawless facade, began to stir a new and dangerous feeling in the hearts of some of those angels, still safe in their gilded parlors. They looked at the world their husbands and fathers had built, a world that worshipped a merciless ideal and created such misery, and they began to wonder if there might be a better way. The cracks were spreading, and something was about to break. And so you find yourself back in that perfect Victorian parlor, the air thick with the scent of polish and piety. You are the angel in the house once again, sitting with your hands folded in your lap, a piece of half-finished embroidery beside you. But you're restless now. You've been on a journey through the hidden-away parts of your city, even if only in your mind. You've felt the crushing boredom of the gilded cage and the heartbreaking despair of the woman who has fallen from it. This perfect room, this temple of respectability, feels different now. The silence seems heavier. The walls feel closer. The single, unwritten rule that says you must be gentle, passive, and pure is starting to chafe like that tightly laced corset. You have a good heart, a quick mind, and absolutely nothing to do with them. Then, an opportunity presents itself. It's an activity that is perfectly, unimpeachably respectable. In fact, it's considered the highest expression of the angelic feminine role, charity work. It allows you to extend the nurturing, compassionate influence of your private sphere into the grimy, godless public world, without actually getting your hands dirty. Or so the theory goes. So you begin. Perhaps you join a committee to organize a soup kitchen. Or you volunteer for a mission to rescue those fallen women we met in the foggy alleyways of our last chapter. You leave your clean, orderly house, chaperoned of course, and you travel to the parts of the city that respectable people pretend do not exist. For the first time, you come face to face with the consequences of your perfect world. You smell the stench of poverty, a mix of unwashed bodies, boiled cabbage, and damp coal that clings to your heavy skirts. You see children with old, haunted faces and the gaunt features of men broken by unforgiving labor. You listen to the stories of the women you are supposed to be rescuing, and you hear not simple tales of moral failure, but complex sagas of exploitation, bad luck, and a system that offered them absolutely no way out. The pristine dollhouse of your imagination shatters. This isn't an abstract problem to be prayed about from the comfort of your parlor. This is real. This is human suffering on a scale you couldn't have conceived of. And your involvement quickly goes beyond ladling soup or handing out blankets. You start organizing. You have to manage donations, which is really budget management. You have to lead committee meetings, which is public speaking and administration. You write letters to fundraise, which is marketing. You author reports on the conditions you've witnessed, which is investigative journalism. Without anyone realizing it, including you, you are becoming an expert. You are mastering the skills of the public sphere, all under the perfectly acceptable banner of Christian charity. You thought you were being an angel. You were actually being trained as a political operative. At the same time, another quiet revolution is happening. A push for female education. It doesn't start as a radical cry for equality. The initial argument is a very respectable one. If a woman's sacred duty is to be a companion to her husband and the first teacher of her children, shouldn't she be an educated companion? Shouldn't she have more to talk about than just the servants and the drapes? And so, a few pioneering institutions are established, places like Girton College at Cambridge, founded in 1869, which offered women an education on par with what men received. The intention was to create more accomplished, more interesting angels for the home. The result was something entirely different. You cannot teach a woman philosophy, history, and classical literature and expect her to be content with arranging flowers. You can't train her in logic and rhetoric and then tell her she isn't equipped to have an opinion on the contagious diseases acts. Education gives you a framework for your anger. It turns your vague feelings of injustice into a structured, coherent critique. The charity work gives you the data, the first-hand evidence of the problem. The education gives you the language and the tools to analyze it. Then comes a wonderfully quirky piece of machinery that changes everything: the bicycle. The invention of the safety bicycle in the late 1880s was more than just a new way to get around. For women, it was a vehicle of liberation. Suddenly, you can travel, unchaperoned, for miles outside your immediate neighborhood. It requires a more practical form of clothing, so-called rational dress with shorter skirts or even bloomers, which was a scandal in itself, freeing you from the constraints of your symbolic cage. Imagine the sheer, dizzying joy of it. The wind in your hair, the speed, the feeling of propelling yourself forward into a new world of your own volition. The bicycle did more to emancipate women than any political speech. It gave them physical autonomy. It was a private sphere on wheels. And so, all the pieces snapped together. The compassionate charity worker, the educated university graduate, and the mobile, independent cyclist all merge into a formidable new figure: the new woman. She is not an angel. She is not a fallen woman. She is something else entirely. And she looks at the rule of respectability, this all-powerful, unwritten law, and she sees it not as a noble ideal, but as a destructive lie. She, and her growing network of similarly awakened women, start asking profoundly unrespectable questions. If we are capable of running national charitable organizations, why can't we vote? If we are legally people, why does our property belong to our husbands when we marry? If men are so morally superior, why are we the only ones punished for the great social evil? Historians still argue about what tipped the scales, whether the fight for suffrage was a direct, compassionate extension of the angel in the house, wanting to clean up politics, or a radical break, a demand for equal rights driven by a new understanding of injustice. It was likely both. The system had sown the seeds of its own destruction. The very tools meant to polish and reinforce the cage of respectability, the charity, the demure education, had become the means of escape. The angel in the house, bored and restless in her perfect parlor, has now stepped out the front door. But this time, she is not timid. She is not afraid. She holds committee reports in one hand and a copy of John Stuart Mill in the other. She is on her way to a rally. She has broken the single rule that held her society together, not by falling, but by standing up. And as the foggy Victorian evening finally gives way to the clear, bright light of a new century, she pedals away, leaving the silent, perfect dollhouse behind her for good. The bizarre luxury of eating ice cream for the first time in the 1700s. The day begins as most others have this summer. The air in your small London apartment is thick and smells faintly of coal smoke, damp wool, and the river. Through the wavy glass of your window, the afternoon sun bakes the cobblestones, turning the street into a simmering gray ribbon crowded with the noise of life. It's a familiar, almost comforting symphony of cart wheels groaning, vendors hawking their wares, and the distant, ever-present clatter of horses on stone. You've been working at your desk for hours, the ink drying almost as soon as it touches the page, and your mind feels as sluggish as the humid air. You are a person of modest but respectable means, perhaps a cartographer, a tutor, or a writer, and your world is one of ink-stained fingers and quiet contemplation. It is not a world of grand surprises. And yet, a surprise has just arrived. It rests on the corner of your desk, a thick, creamy square of cardstock delivered by a young boy in livery who seemed utterly out of place in your narrow, creaking stairwell. The card feels impossibly heavy, its edges gilded with a thin line of gold that catches the light. The script upon it is a work of art, a cascade of looping, elegant letters that you have to decipher as much as read. It is an invitation. Not just any invitation, but one from Lord Harrington, a man whose name you know mostly from the society pages of the newspapers. You once did a small service for him, drew a map of a minor estate, or perhaps catalogued a few books in his library, and you assumed the transaction and any connection was long since concluded. But here it is, an invitation to dine at his London residence. This evening. The sheer spontaneity of it is baffling. In your world, things are planned weeks, if not months, in advance. A dinner party is a strategic operation, not a whim. You run a thumb over the embossed family crest, a creature that is half lion, half eagle, and wholly intimidating. You should, by all accounts, be thrilled. An evening in such company could open doors, secure patronage, elevate your standing. But mostly, what you feel is a gentle wave of weariness. It means navigating a minefield of unspoken rules, of subtle hierarchies laid out in silverware, of conversations as layered and dense as a 7-course meal. It sounds exhausting, and yet, it's an invitation you cannot refuse. So, as evening descends and casts a hazy, bruised purple glow over the city, you find yourself preparing. You pull out your best coat, the dark wool one that you brush with meticulous care. It is respectable, but under the 1,000-candle glare of Lord Harrington's ballroom, it will likely look provincial, almost rustic. You spend a comical amount of time on your wig, repowdering it until the air around your head hangs in a white cloud, hoping it looks more distinguished gentleman and less frightened pastry. Every step of the preparation feels like donning a costume for a play you've never rehearsed. Your transportation is a hired hackney carriage, its springs groaning in protest as it jostles you through the darkening streets. The familiar city begins to transform. You leave behind the cramped alleyways and modest townhouses of your own neighborhood, and the buildings grow grander, taller, set farther back from the road as if they are too proud to mingle with the common thoroughfare. Gas lamps, still a novelty and a luxury, begin to appear, casting pools of steady, ethereal light that make the flickering oil lamps seem ancient and crude. It feels like you're traveling forward in time, or at least into a different reality. You arrive at a house that seems to occupy a whole side of the square. It's not a house, it's a palace. Light pours from every window. Through the vast, clear panes, you can see the silhouettes of guests milling about, their powdered wigs bobbing like whitecaps on a gentle sea. A footman, looking impossibly tall and serene, opens your carriage door and announces your name with a resonance that makes you feel both important and utterly insignificant. Inside, the air is warm, thick with the scent of beeswax candles, expensive perfume, and roasted meats. The sound is a low, melodious hum, the murmur of 100 private conversations blending into a single, opulent chord. You move through the rooms in a sort of dreamlike state, accepting a small glass of chilled wine, nodding at faces you vaguely recognize. The dinner itself is an ordeal of polite pageantry. Course after course arrives, a parade of culinary architecture. A glistening salmon lies on a bed of greens. A tower of quail eggs stands precariously beside a roasted swan, its feathers meticulously reattached. It is all magnificent, and you taste almost none of it, your focus consumed by the task of using the correct fork and laughing at the appropriate moments. It is after the final savory course, after the jellies and blancmanges have been cleared, that the real performance begins. A hush falls over the dining hall. Servants enter, moving with a synchronized, solemn grace. But instead of carrying another gleaming silver platter of pastries or fruits, each one holds a small, delicate vessel. Some are made of silver, others of fine pewter, and a few are even made of glass, nested inside a larger bowl. They place one before each guest. You stare at the thing in front of you. It doesn't look like food. Inside the small cup is a perfectly smooth, pale mound. It gives off no scent, but you can feel something radiating from it, a coldness. A deep, unnatural chill that seems impossible on this warm summer night. A wisp of vapor, like a phantom's breath, curls up from its surface and vanishes. The other guests lean forward, their faces filled with a knowing, eager anticipation. Your host, Lord Harrington, beams from the head of the table. A taste of winter in the heart of July, he proclaims, his voice booming with the pride of a magician who is about to perform his master trick. He explains, with no small amount of smugness, that what you are about to eat is an ice cream. A cream, flavored with fruit and frozen solid. Frozen. The word hangs in the air, a logical impossibility. You know what ice is? It's the stuff that crusts the edges of the Thames in January, the brittle sheets that have to be smashed for water, the cause of broken pipes and miserable, shivering nights. It is a temporary hardship of winter. It does not, cannot, exist in this room, on this sweltering evening. Where could it possibly come from? As if reading your thoughts, a lady seated nearby leans towards you and whispers conspiratorially, "His lordship has one of the finest ice houses in London, dug 30 feet into the earth. It is said he can keep winter's ice until the autumn harvest." An ice house. You've seen such structures on country estates, odd, conical mounds of earth, sometimes with a small stone door, looking like the barrows of ancient kings. You had always assumed they were for storing root vegetables or perhaps smoking meats. You never considered their name to be literal. The idea is staggering. Laborers in the freezing depths of winter would have been dispatched to nearby lakes and rivers to saw great blocks of ice from the frozen water. These colossal slabs, weighing hundreds of pounds, were then hauled by horse and cart to the estate and painstakingly lowered into a deep, brick-lined pit. They were packed with straw and sawdust, insulated from the world, a captured piece of winter held prisoner underground. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for these costly ventures was the practical preservation of perishable foods or the sheer theatricality of serving chilled wonders like this, a way to demonstrate absolute command over the seasons themselves. You imagine the dark, cold, silent world inside that pit. The damp smell of straw and earth, the ghostly presence of the slowly melting ice, a hibernation of coldness waiting to be summoned. It was a fringe science, almost an alchemy, a defiance of nature that cost a fortune in both labor and resources. Having an ice house was the 18th century equivalent of owning a private waterfall in your living room. It was absurd, it was magnificent, and it was the ultimate symbol that you were wealthy enough to make the impossible happen. You learned that keeping the ice was a fickle business. An improperly designed pit, a poor seal on the door, or a mild winter could mean the entire, costly harvest was lost to a disappointing puddle by June. It was a constant battle against the sun, against the warmth of the earth itself. People told strange tales of ice houses, of servants refusing to enter them after dark, claiming they were haunted by the spirits of winter. A quirky but common tidbit shared among the servants was the necessity of placing a cat inside overnight before sealing it for the season, to ensure all the rats were cleared out, lest they chew through the precious insulation. One shudders to think about the fate of the cat. A light joke, you suppose, for those who don't have to work in the chilling darkness. And all of this, the brutal winter harvest, the back-breaking labor, the architectural ingenuity, the immense cost, has culminated in this small, silent, pale mound sitting before you in a silver cup. It represents a secret world of immense effort, hidden beneath a grassy knoll. It is the ghost of winter, served on a silver spoon. Your own spoon feels heavy in your hand as you lift it, the cold from the dish seeming to travel up the metal into your fingertips. You are about to taste a miracle, or at least a miracle of logistics. But before the spoon completes its journey, your mind snags on the question. How? Not just the ice, which is a marvel in itself, but the transformation. How do you take a liquid, a simple cream sweetened and flavored, and command it to become this solid, frozen thing? The process seems less like cooking, and more like an act of forbidden science, something performed in a hushed laboratory rather than a kitchen. Your imagination, always your most restless faculty, drifts away from the hushed elegance of the dining hall, down the winding servants' staircases, and into the beating, chaotic heart of this grand house, the kitchen. In your mind's eye, the scene is one of organized pandemonium. Where the dining room is a world of cool blues, soft candlelight, and gentle murmurs, the kitchen is a cavern of fiery oranges, roaring heat, and a percussive symphony of clanging copper and shouted commands. It is a subterranean furnace, blazing even on this warm night. A vast fireplace, large enough for you to stand in, dominates one wall, roasting birds on a complex mechanical spit. The air is thick with steam, smoke, and the sweat of 24 people moving in a frantic, yet practiced, choreography. Here, there are no powdered wigs or delicate silks, only damp linen caps, aprons stained with grease and flour, and faces flushed red from the heat. This is the engine room of the opulent ship you are sailing on upstairs, and it runs on raw human effort. You picture a corner of this bustling space, cordoned off as if for a sacred ritual. This is the domain of the confectioner, a specialist who deals not in the robust world of roasts and sauces, but in the delicate, sugary arts of jellies, pastries, and now, this frozen novelty. The confectioner is a man of intense focus, a culinary artist whose patrons are forever demanding new sensations. Today, his masterpiece is ice cream. The process begins with the arrival of the star ingredient. Not cream, not sugar, but ice. A kitchen boy, his arms straining, hauls in a heavy canvas sack dripping a trail of water onto the stone flags. Inside is a small block of the precious ice from the underground house, still packed in its shroud of straw and sawdust. The block is cloudy, opaque, a piece of captured winter sky. It's immediately set upon by another boy with a mallet and chisel, who breaks it down into smaller, manageable chunks, a task that sends sharp, cold chips flying through the humid air. And now the alchemy begins. The apparatus itself is deceptively simple. In your mind, you see a sturdy wooden bucket. Inside it rests a smaller, pewter pot with a tightly fitting lid. This pewter pot is the heart of the operation, what the French chefs call a sorbetier. It is into this pot that the confectioner's assistant pours the base mixture, a rich, golden cream, infused with sugar and, tonight, the delicate essence of apricot and orange flower water. This itself is a luxury. Such flavorings were often imported, expensive, and used with a reverence usually reserved for religious incense. Some chefs, eager to impress, might use even more exotic ingredients. Quirky tidbits of recipes call for flavors like saffron, rose water, or even ambergris, that strange, waxy substance from the sea, prized for its complex, musky aroma. A dessert flavored with whale secretion is certainly one way to tell your guests you've run out of ideas, or that you simply have more money than you know what to do with. Once the sweet cream is sealed within the pewter pot, the real labor starts. The crushed ice is shoveled into the wooden bucket, filling the space all around the sorbetier. Then comes the secret ingredient, the catalyst for the miracle, salt. A generous amount of coarse rock salt is thrown in, layering with the ice. You, being a person of letters and some scientific curiosity, might understand the principle. The salt, by mixing with the ice, forces it to melt at a temperature far below its natural freezing point. It doesn't warm the ice, it tricks it into becoming a supercooled, frigid brine, a liquid so cold it can steal the heat right through the wall of the pewter pot. For the kitchen staff, it isn't science, it is simply magic, a necessary incantation to summon the cold. And now, for the next half hour or more, two strong kitchen boys are tasked with the grueling job of agitating the pewter pot. One holds the bucket steady while the other grips the handle of the pot and begins to turn and shake it with all his might. Back and forth, a constant sloshing, jarring motion. It is not a gentle churning. It is a violent, muscle-straining ordeal. Their faces are grim with concentration, sweat beading on their foreheads, a stark contrast to the effortless grace of the guests upstairs. Every few minutes, they stop. The head confectioner steps in, removes the lid of the pewter pot, and uses a long spatula, a spattle, to scrape the inside walls. The cream that is in contact with the pot freezes first, forming a hard layer of ice crystals. This layer must be scraped off and mixed back into the center. This scraping and churning is the crucial step. Without it, you wouldn't get cream. You'd get a solid, inedible block of sweet, flavored ice. The goal is smoothness, a texture born from endless agitation. It's this very process that has led to a quiet debate among food historians. They still argue over the precise evolution of the technology. While a proper, efficient, hand-cranked ice cream freezer, the kind with a built-in paddle that does the scraping for you, would be patented by an American woman named Nancy Johnson in the next century, it's debated whether simpler, geared mechanisms existed in the most advanced European kitchens of your time. Did Lord Harrington's confectioner have some secret, prototypic device, a hand-cranked pot within a bucket, that made this process slightly less agonizing? Or are those boys really just shaking a metal can in a bucket of salt ice for 30 minutes, their arms burning with the effort? A truly absurd amount of work for a dessert that will be consumed in less than 5 minutes. It's a joke of inefficiency that only the very rich could afford to tell. Your imaginary vantage point watches as the process repeats. Shake, turn, slosh. Open, scrape. Shake, turn, slosh. Open, scrape. The liquid cream slowly, stubbornly thickens. It transforms from a splashing liquid to a thick slurry, then to a soft, yielding paste. The air immediately around the bucket becomes intensely cold. The kitchen boy's hands are red and raw from the biting chill of the brine. Finally, the confectioner scrapes the spattle through the mixture, and it holds its shape. A small mountain range of soft, pale orange cream stands in the pot. It is done. The finished ice cream is quickly transferred into the delicate serving cups, perhaps the very glass and silver ones now sitting in front of you. It must be moved with haste, for its existence is fleeting. The moment it leaves the sanctuary of its frigid bucket, it begins to die, to surrender its impossible coldness back to the warm air of the room. A whole team of servants is mobilized just to carry these few small dishes from the kitchen to the dining hall in the precious seconds before the magic fades. Your mind drifts back from the imagined heat and toil of the kitchen to the cool, calm opulence of the dining room. The spoon is still in your hand. The small, perfect mound still sits before you, radiating its gentle, impossible cold. Knowing, or at least imagining, the frantic, sweaty, alchemical process that gave it birth makes it all the more extraordinary. It's not just food. It is the pinnacle of a pyramid of human effort, a single, perfect snowflake resting on a mountain of firewood, sweat, and toil. You lift the spoon again, the final inch of its journey seeming to last an eternity. You are finally ready to taste the miracle. The spoon, a tiny silver shovel, pauses a mere inch from your lips. It feels strangely heavy, weighted with the effort of the kitchen below and the expectation of the room around you. The world seems to have shrunk to this single, crystalline spoonful. You can feel the eyes of the other guests upon you, but their gaze is casual, a fleeting curiosity to see how a newcomer reacts to the house specialty. It's part of the evening's entertainment. To them, your reaction is the real dessert. You see a gentleman across the table, a man with a face like a contented bulldog, expertly scoop and eat his portion with the bored efficiency of someone long accustomed to miracles. You finally close the small distance. The moment the spoon crosses your lips is a moment of profound sensory confusion. The first sensation is the cold, but it's a quality of cold you have never before experienced as a flavor, as a food. It is not the pleasant coolness of a sip of well water or a crisp apple from the cellar. It is a deep, penetrating, almost aggressive chill. It is the cold of a surgeon's scalpel, sharp and clean and shocking. It zings against the sensitive surfaces of your tongue and the roof of your mouth, a painless, icy sting that makes every nerve stand to attention. You try not to visibly flinch. You fight the primal urge to pull back from this pleasant-looking poison, this beautiful, frozen assault. Your brain, having no frame of reference for such an event, briefly considers issuing a full-scale panic, a response one might have to licking a metal fence post in the dead of winter. A malady so perplexing you assume it's a minor form of demonic possession exclusive to the upper classes, perhaps. Then, just as the shock of the cold is about to become overwhelming, a second transformation begins. It starts to melt. The warmth of your own body, a simple biological fact you have always taken for granted, becomes a powerful force of alchemy. The solid gives way, collapsing into a luscious, velvety liquid on your tongue. And with that collapse, the texture reveals itself. It is smoothness perfected. It's not the gelatinous quiver of a jelly, nor the slight grain of a well-sifted pudding. It is seamless, an unbroken creaminess that speaks directly of the frantic, scraping, churning labor you imagined in the kitchen below. Each tiny ice crystal was beaten into submission, forced to surrender its sharp edges to create this impossible, uniform silkiness. It coats your mouth in a way that is both rich and ethereal. And then, as the last of the cold retreats, the flavor blooms. The apricot, no longer locked away in its frozen prison, emerges. It is not a loud flavor, but a gentle, sunny ghost of the fruit, its sweetness amplified by the pure sugar and the incredible richness of the cream. Following it is a faint, floral whisper of the orange flower water, a scent as much as a taste, an exotic grace note that speaks of faraway places and expensive imports. The combination is sublime. The taste is at once intense and fleeting, a vibrant burst that fades almost as soon as it appears, leaving behind only a faint, sweet memory and a lingering, phantom chill in the back of your throat. You swallow. The act is anticlimactic after the symphony of sensation that preceded it. You take another, smaller spoonful, more prepared this time. You savor the journey, the icy shock, the creamy melt, the blooming flavor. It is a three-act play performed in your mouth in seconds. You glance around the table again. This isn't just a dessert. This is a topic of conversation, a shared performance. The host, Lord Harrington, is watching everyone's faces, basking in the reflected glow of their astonishment and pleasure. You now understand that this experience has a long and noble pedigree. While it feels like a bizarre novelty to you, this is the kind of confection that has been gracing the tables of royalty for decades. You recall reading that King Charles II himself, the merry monarch, was served a rare treat of iced cream at a great feast over a century ago, a spectacle recorded for posterity. It was food for kings, a way for a monarch to display his immense power not through armies or edicts, but by serving his guests a taste of defiance against God's own seasons. What sits in your little silver cup is a direct descendant of that royal power, trickling down to the highest echelons of the aristocracy. And that is the true, hidden flavor of the ice cream, status. With each spoonful, you are tasting your host's immense wealth. The cost of the ice, the labor to harvest and store it, the skilled confectioner, the expensive sugar and imported flavorings, the specialized pewter pots, all of it culminates in this ephemeral mouthful. It is the most inefficient food ever conceived. A ridiculous expenditure of resources for a fleeting sensory pleasure. And that is precisely the point. Lord Harrington isn't serving you food, he's serving you evidence. Evidence that he can afford to waste a small fortune on something that will literally vanish into thin air. It is the 18th century equivalent of owning a chariot made of solid gold. It is impressive, it is beautiful, and its primary function is to be completely and utterly impractical. The theatricality doesn't stop with the taste, either. A woman near you exclaims in delight as she discovers her portion has been artfully turned out of a mold in the perfect shape of a pear, complete with a tiny, candied angelica stalk for a stem. This was another layer of the art form. Confectioners guarded their collections of pewter molds with the jealousy of state secrets. They could create entire frozen menageries and gardens on a platter. A pineapple made of pineapple ice cream. A hen sitting on a nest of frozen ice cream eggs. Serving a perfect, frozen swan to your guests is a subtle way of saying, not only did I have this beautiful bird killed for you, I then paid a small army to bring it back to life as a very, very cold ghost. Historians still debate how this intricate knowledge of molding frozen foods was shared. Was there a guild of clandestine ice sculpting chefs, passing down their techniques from master to apprentice, or was it a skill that had to be rediscovered through messy, trial and error in each great house? The ice cream is gone all too soon. Your little cup is empty, save for a few glistening milky streaks. The servants, ever watchful, glide in and remove the dishes with the same silent efficiency they arrived with. The moment is over. The conversation at the table shifts to politics, to a new play that has just opened, to a mild scandal involving a viscount and a deck of marked cards. The miraculous has become mundane once more. But for you, something has shifted. The world feels slightly different. Your understanding of luxury, of wealth, of power, has a new dimension. You have witnessed the sheer, casual extravagance of making summer taste of winter. You've had a food that isn't just tasted, but experienced. The memory of it, that impossible cold, that perfect smoothness, is as much a physical echo as it is a mental one. You feel the lingering chill in your chest, a souvenir from Lord Harrington's secret, subterranean winter. It's a strange and strangely pleasant sensation, and you suspect it will stay with you for a very long time. The dinner concludes not long after the ice cream. The polite ritual of departure begins, a slow exodus of perfumed silk and powdered wigs into the cool night air. You murmur your thanks to Lord Harrington, trying to find words that adequately express your gratitude for the experience. An unforgettable evening, you say, which is both perfectly polite and absolutely true. He merely nods, the serene, knowing smile never leaving his face. He knows. He has just given you a memory designed to be unforgettable. Your hired carriage jostles you back through the moonlit streets, away from the grand squares and gaslit boulevards and toward your own far more modest corner of London. The contrast is more jarring on the return journey. The grandeur of Lord Harrington's world makes your own reality seem smaller, dimmer. The faint scent of coal and river that you barely noticed earlier now seems thick and cloying. As you climb the narrow, creaking stairs to your apartment, you can still feel that phantom chill deep in your chest, a cool spot behind your sternum that is the ghost of the ice cream. You sit at your desk, but not to work. The room is quiet, the candle casting a soft, familiar glow on your books and papers. You look at your ink-stained hands and think of the kitchen boy's hands, red and chapped from the frigid brine. You think of the sheer, coordinated human effort, from the ice harvesters on a frozen lake in January to the footman rushing the melting dish up the stairs in July, that was required for your 5 minutes of sensory delight. It was a chain of labor that stretched across seasons, all culminating in that single, impossible mouthful. The ice cream wasn't just a dessert, it was a compact narrative of power. Your mind begins to wander, contemplating the future of this bizarre luxury. Tonight, it was the exclusive domain of royalty and the highest tier of the aristocracy. It was a secret language of status, spoken in silver cups in candlelit dining rooms. But secrets like this have a way of getting out. A cook's apprentice, having mastered the difficult art, might leave a great house to open his own small confectionery shop. A wealthy merchant, desperate to imitate the style of his social superiors, might bribe that same apprentice for his secrets. You imagine the idea slowly trickling down through the layers of society. Perhaps in a few years, you might see a small sign in the window of a particularly ambitious coffee house. Ice is available. They would not be as fine as Lord Harrington's, of course. The cream might not be as rich, the sugar less refined. The flavorings would be simpler, lemon perhaps, or coffee, not the exotic orange flower water and apricot. The process would still be laborious and expensive, meaning a single taste would cost more than a common laborer earns in a day. It would still be a scandalous indulgence, something whispered about, a treat for a very special occasion. It would be a taste of aspiration, a way for the rising merchant class to feel, just for a moment, like a lord. You consider the mainstream historical impact of such small culinary shifts. Things like the burgeoning sugar trade, a global enterprise built on a foundation of human misery in far-off colonies, are what make this dessert possible for more than just a handful of kings. The increasing availability of sugar, the white gold, transforms it from a medicine and a spice into a staple of confectionery and, eventually, a ubiquitous ingredient. The ice cream in your cup tonight was a delicious footnote in a much larger, and often brutal, economic story. Remember that strange fashion for black-painted teeth among Elizabethan nobles to show they could afford sugar? This frozen confection is just a more sophisticated, and frankly more pleasant, way of broadcasting the same message of wealth. Then your mind turns to the scholarly questions, the inevitable debates that people of your inquisitive nature love to ponder. You wonder about the true origins of this strange food. Lord Harrington presented it with the flair of a modern marvel, but you've read accounts, scraps of information, that suggest a much older and more varied history. Historians still argue whether the concept of frozen desserts was an independent European invention, or if, as rumored, the idea was brought back from China by travelers like Marco Polo centuries ago. Did ancient emperors in the East possess a similar command over ice, using it to create frozen delicacies flavored with honey and fruit long before any English king thought to do so? There's also the Arab world to consider, with their sherbets, the ancestor of the sorbet, which were chilled with snow brought down from the mountains. It's a pleasing thought that this intensely European display of status might actually be a borrowed notion, a quirky tidbit of cultural appropriation from a civilization they considered less advanced. The future you imagine for this dessert is one of gradual democratization. You picture small, cheerful ice cream parlors a century from now, open to the public, where families might go for a Sunday treat. You imagine Nancy Johnson's hand-cranked freezer making the process easier, taking it out of the exclusive domain of powerful kitchens and putting it into the hands of households. You can even stretch your imagination to a ridiculous extreme, a future where this frozen novelty is mass-produced in great factories, where it becomes a common food, sold on street corners for pennies, enjoyed by children and workers, completely detached from its origins as a spectacle of aristocratic power. It seems like a pleasant, if laughable, fantasy, a dessert that requires a 30-foot hole in the ground and the toil of a dozen servants becoming a casual snack for the common man. Preposterous. As you finally ready yourself for bed, blowing out the last candle, the memory of the taste returns one last time. The initial shock of cold, the silky melt, the gentle bloom of apricot. It was, you conclude, the most beautifully inefficient and ridiculously profound thing you have ever eaten. It was a lesson in physics, economics, and social hierarchy, all served in a single dish. You get into bed, the linen sheets cool against your skin, and as you drift towards sleep, you realize you are no longer chilled. The phantom cold has faded, replaced by a warm and sleepy curiosity. What other hidden worlds, what other secret alchemies, are humming along just beneath the surface of the world you think you know? It is a gentle, soothing thought, and on it, you float off to dream, not of sugar plums, but of impossible, inexplicable cold. The story of the last person to speak a now extinct language. The first thing you are aware of is the light. Not a sharp, intrusive light, but a soft, gray, milky light, the kind that filters through sea mist and ancient window panes. It fills your small room with a gentle, watery luminescence, smoothing the sharp edges of the furniture into soft suggestions of themselves. The old wooden dresser, the high-backed chair with a shawl draped over it, the faded photograph on the wall of two people who no longer exist. They are all swimming in this quiet morning twilight. The air is cool and carries the faint, familiar scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something vaguely salty, a gift from the nearby sea. You lie still for a moment, under the weight of the heavy quilts, letting the world assemble itself around you. But the real world, the one that truly matters, is already awake inside your head. It murmurs to you, not in the language of the village, the one used for buying bread and talking about the weather, but in the other tongue. The old tongue. Your first thought of the day forms itself, a smooth, intricate vessel of sound that has nowhere to go. It is a thought about the quality of the morning light, and the word for it has no equivalent in the new language. It is a word that means something like the light that feels like a memory, a perfect, single-word poem that you can never share. You swing your legs out of bed, the floorboards cool and slightly uneven beneath your bare feet. The house is silent, but your mind is not. The internal monologue is a constant companion, a river of old words flowing through you. You think about stoking the fire, and the words for kindling, ember, and ash drift through your consciousness. They are words with deep roots, words that feel like they are carved from stone and polished by wind. The language of the merchants and the tax collectors, the one you must use every day, feels thin and flimsy by comparison. A bit like comparing a well-worn leather satchel to a piece of paper. One is good for carrying important things, the other is mostly for scribbling down lists you're bound to lose. As you coax the embers back to life in the small hearth, you speak your first words of the day. They are not in the old tongue. You cannot waste it on the cat, who is weaving between your ankles with an expression of profound, theatrical starvation. All right, hold your horses. You mutter in the common language, your voice a little rough from sleep. The phrase feels alien in your mouth. Clumsy. Why horses? You've never owned one. The old tongue would have used a phrase about a hungry tide nagging at the shore, something that made a quiet kind of sense. Talking to the cat is a light form of madness, you suppose, but it's better than the echoing quiet. The cat, at least, doesn't judge your grammar. With the fire crackling and a kettle set to boil, you walk to the window. You look out over the familiar landscape, a patchwork of small, stony fields rolling down to a gray, restless sea. The mist is thick today, obscuring the horizon, making the world feel small and intimate. This view is a lexicon. Every rock, every stubborn twist of heather, every turn in the winding path has a name in the old tongue. You remember your father standing at this very window, pointing out a specific configuration of clouds and giving it a name that meant the sorrow of the sky. He didn't mean it sadly, it was just a name for a weather pattern, a piece of poetry embedded in meteorology. The world outside has moved on. The school you attended as a child, a small, drafty building that always smelled of wet wool and disappointment, was the place where the slow erasure began. The schoolmaster, a man from the inland, with a stiff collar and even stiffer ideas, had no time for the old tongue. He called it backward, a peasant's mumble. The king's language was the language of progress, of trade, of the future. The mainstream historical narrative of your own life is this. You were taught, firmly and sometimes painfully, to be ashamed of the words that built your world. You learned to keep the old language for home, a secret whispered by the fire. Then for conversations with just a few aging neighbors. Then with just one other person. And then one quiet Tuesday for no one at all. Now you stand here, a living archive, a library of one. It is a strange and mostly lonely distinction. Linguists still argue whether a language dies when its last speaker passes away, or whether its death occurs at the moment the second-to-last speaker dies, severing the possibility of a final conversation. You suppose, in a technical sense, that you are merely the curator of a dead thing, the caretaker of a museum with no visitors. Your thoughts are the exhibits, artifacts no one else can see or appreciate. You are the sole inhabitant of an invisible nation. You turn away from the window as the kettle begins to whistle, a shrill, modern sound. You make your tea and sit at the small wooden table. The silence of the house presses in again. Sometimes you find yourself mouthing the old words silently, just to feel the shape of them in your mouth, the way your tongue has to press against your teeth for a certain sound, the way a vowel has to resonate in your chest. It is an exercise in memory, a physical ritual. The quirks of the language are what you cherish most. A fringe tidbit of your linguistic heritage is that there are 17 different words for shadow, depending on what is casting it, the time of day, and whether it is summer or winter. It's a level of specificity the new language, with its blunt, pragmatic efficiency, simply cannot match. You wonder what the schoolmaster would have thought of that. Probably a colossal waste of time. This quiet morning is like all the others. A slow, meditative routine, steeped in a silence that is not empty but full. It is full of the ghosts of words, the echoes of conversations from half a century ago. It is full of songs no one else will ever sing, jokes no one else will ever understand, and terms of endearment that will never again be spoken with affection. You are not just one person having breakfast. You are a council of ghosts, a choir of ancestors, all having their morning tea inside your head. It is not a sad feeling, not exactly. It is simply a large and quiet wait. You sip your tea and prepare for the day, unaware that the quiet is about to be interrupted. The morning unfolds into afternoon with the slow, deliberate rhythm that has come to define your days. Your world is one of small, essential tasks. You spend some time in the garden, a small plot of defiant green wrested from the stony soil. You pull weeds, your fingers tracing the familiar shapes of roots and leaves. Here, too, the old language lives. You know the secret names for every plant, not just the tidy, catalogued names of the botanist's book, but the names that tell you a story. There is a tough, wiry weed called trickster's shoelace, and a pale, delicate flower known as maiden's sigh. To name them is to remember who taught you the names, and to whom they taught them before that. It's a quiet conversation with ghosts among the potato plants. Later, you sit by the window, mending a tear in a thick woolen sock, the rhythmic push and pull of the needle a kind of meditation. The light has shifted, growing warmer, turning the sea from gray to a hazy, slate blue. The only sounds are the gentle crackle from the hearth, the distant cry of a gull, and the whisper of thread passing through wool. It is a peaceful existence, a solitude so profound and unbroken that it has become its own kind of companion. You have become accustomed to the shape of the silence, and that is why the new sound is so jarring. It is the crunch of unfamiliar footsteps on the gravel path leading to your cottage. They are hesitant, then purposeful. Not the heavy, familiar tread of the postman, nor the shuffling scuff of the boy who occasionally delivers supplies from the village. These are the footsteps of a stranger, someone unaccustomed to the uneven ground, someone from away. You pause your mending, the needle held midair. The cat lifts its head from a patch of sun on the floor, its ears twitching. It heard it too. In this quiet world, a stranger is a major event. It is an unexpected line in a well-rehearsed play. You rise and move to the door, opening it just a crack. Standing on your doorstep is a young man. He looks impossibly young, with a face that seems to have missed out on its fair share of weather. He is thin, dressed in city clothes that are already starting to look wilted and out of place here. A tweed jacket a little too warm for the walk, trousers that are clean but creased. He looks like he'd lose a serious argument with a strong gust of wind. He blinks at you through a pair of spectacles perched on his nose, looking earnest and profoundly nervous. "Good day," he says in the king's tongue, his accent clipped and academic. "I hope I am not disturbing you. I am looking for—" He falters, pulling a small, rumpled notebook from his jacket pocket and consulting it as if it might give him courage. He says your name, a little uncertainly. You simply nod, your hand still resting on the cool wood of the door. You say nothing. Silence is a fine defense. It forces the other person to fill the void, and in doing so, they often reveal themselves. "My name is Alastair Finch," he rushes on, a blush rising up his neck. "I am a linguist, a phonetician from the university. I've come a rather long way." He gestures vaguely back toward the world that exists beyond your stony fields. "I was told, I have heard, that you still have command of the old tongue, the language of this place." Your heart gives a little flutter, a complicated knot of surprise and suspicion. For decades, the old tongue has been a thing to be hidden, a source of quiet shame. Now this stranger, this boy from a university, is standing on your doorstep asking about it as if it were a treasure. It makes no sense. It is not spoken now. You say, your voice flat, non-committal. This is your standard line, the one that ends unwanted inquiries. The young man's face falls for a moment, but then his expression hardens with a determined resolve. "Forgive me," he says, his voice lowering with sincerity. "I understand it is not spoken. That is precisely why I am here. Languages they are like species of birds. When the last one is gone, the sky is emptier. A whole way of seeing the world vanishes forever. I want to record it, to preserve it." He seems to sense he is losing you, that your door is about to close. So, with a surge of clumsy energy, he turns and begins to unstrap a large, leather-bound case he has set down on the path. He fumbles with the buckles, his eagerness making him clumsy. Finally, he gets it open, and from the case, he lifts the most peculiar object you have ever seen. He sets it down on the ground with a reverence you find both odd and touching. It is a machine. A base of dark, polished wood supports a mechanism of brass gears and a rotating mandrel. Attached to this apparatus is a large, cone-shaped horn, made of polished tin or brass, flaring out like the bell of a bizarre mechanical flower. It looks like a device one might invent to communicate with very important, and possibly very deaf, snails. This is the curious horn. The young man, Alistair, calls it a phonograph. It is a marvel of the new age, he explains, his eyes gleaming with enthusiasm. He tells you how it works, pointing with a long, thin finger. His own voice is captured by the horn, transformed into vibrations. A tiny, sharp needle, a stylus, is attached to a diaphragm, and as the diaphragm vibrates, the stylus cuts a groove into a soft wax cylinder that he mounts onto the central spindle. A perfect, microscopic, physical copy of a sound. It catches a voice, he says, looking at you with desperate hope. It holds it. It can keep your words safe long after they would otherwise be gone. He is offering you a strange and unsettling kind of immortality. He is offering your language, the language of your ancestors, of your private thoughts, of the 17 words for shadow, a life after you are gone. He wants to turn the ghosts in your head into ghosts in a machine. The whole notion sits strangely with you. The idea of your voice being scratched onto a piece of wax is unnerving. This brings up one of the great scholarly debates surrounding his very profession. Historians still argue whether these early linguists and ethnographers, men like Alistair, were heroes of preservation or simply well-intentioned collectors. Were they saving worlds, or were they plundering them, taking the most sacred part of a culture, its voice, and reducing it to a scientific specimen in an archive, divorced from its soul and context? Alistair sees himself as a savior. You see a young man with a strange machine asking to take something from you that you didn't even realize you had the power to give away. You learn later that the business of sound catching is fraught with its own quirks. A tidbit he shares is the vulnerability of his precious wax cylinders. One archivist discovered that a certain type of benign fungus found his collection to be an exquisite delicacy, leaving feathery patterns across the delicate grooves and rendering the recordings an unintelligible whisper. The idea that a language could survive generations of societal pressure only to be devoured by mold strikes you as a joke of cosmic proportions. Perhaps you'll ask Alistair if he wants to record the cat's litany of complaints instead. Its hunger is certainly consistent enough to survive a little fungus. The young man has stopped talking now. He is just watching you, waiting. The phonograph sits between you, a silent, brass question mark. He has traveled all this way. He has brought this miracle of engineering to your door, all to listen to you speak. He does not want to shame your words or erase them. He wants to worship them. He wants to put them under glass. And now you have a decision to make. Do you send him and his curious machine away and let the old tongue finish its slow, private fade into silence? Or do you take a deep breath and speak to the ghost catcher? You stand there for a long moment, the quiet stretching between you and the earnest young man. He is waiting, his face a mixture of hope and anxiety. The brass horn of his phonograph seems to watch you with a single, unblinking eye. You look past him, at the stony fields and the gray sea, the landscape that gave birth to the very words he is seeking. You think of your father and his sorrow of the sky. You think of the 17 words for shadow. You think of the sheer, lonely weight of being the last one. Perhaps being the curator of a museum with a single, very eager visitor is better than no visitors at all. You give a slow, deliberate nod. A flicker of immense relief washes over Alistair's face, and he almost sags against the doorframe. You do not invite him into the cottage. Not yet. The house is your inner sanctum. Instead, you gesture towards a small, sturdy wooden bench that sits against the cottage wall, bathed in the pale afternoon sun. Here, you say, the single word in the king's tongue holding a quiet authority. He nods enthusiastically and begins the delicate process of moving his equipment. He handles the phonograph with the tenderness of a new father holding his child, placing it gently on the grass. He sets up a small camp stool for himself across from your bench, creating a makeshift studio in the open air. The cat, intrigued by the newcomer, comes over to investigate, rubbing itself against the leg of the tripod with a proprietary air. An excellent judge of character, Alistair jokes weakly, trying to lighten the momentous atmosphere. It is a light attempt at humor in a situation that feels anything but. When all is ready, he gestures for you to sit. You settle onto the bench, your back straight, your hands resting in your lap. He places a fresh, blank wax cylinder onto the machine's mandrel. It is a pale, waxy brown color, perfectly smooth. An unmarked page. He adjusts the horn so it points directly at you, its great brass mouth aimed at your heart. It feels unnervingly like a weapon, or perhaps a confession booth. "Now," he says softly, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, just say anything. The first things that come to your mind. A nursery rhyme. The names of things you see. Anything at all." He sets a small mechanism, and the cylinder begins to turn with a soft whirring sound. A faint scraping noise tells you the stylus is now touching the wax, carving its silent, expectant groove. The machine is listening. You take a deep breath, and you open your mouth, and the first thing that comes out is a torrent of sound that you yourself haven't heard spoken aloud in years. It is a child's counting rhyme, one your mother used to recite while kneading bread. The words feel both alien and deeply familiar, like seeing your own reflection in a dusty, long-forgotten mirror. Your voice is a little shaky at first, stiff with disuse. But as you speak, the old rhythms return. The language has its own music, a rise and fall that echoes the lilt of the waves on the shore. It flows out of you, filling the quiet afternoon. Alistair doesn't move. He stares at his machine, his head tilted, listening not to the meaning of the words, but to their pure sound, his face rapt. He is a priest attending a sacred rite. The cat, perhaps sensing the shift in the world's vibrations, ceases its prowling and sits at your feet, watching you. After the rhyme, you pause. The cylinder continues to spin. "Tell me about this place," Alistair prompts gently. And so you do. You begin to speak to the ghosts. You look out at the landscape, and you start naming it, speaking into the horn. You give the true names for the hills in the distance, for the rocky outcrop on the beach, for the type of wind that is blowing today. You tell the horn the story of how that particular windswept tree got its twisted shape, a story involving a lightning strike and a particularly stubborn sheep. It is a story you have told 100 times in your mind, but never allowed to another soul. The act of giving these memories voice is strange. It is like decanting old wine. You can only hope the fresh air doesn't spoil it. You start with the old words, the myths, the folk tales. The mainstream historical knowledge of your people is woven into these stories. You recite a piece of a local epic, a long, rambling poem about a fisherman who fell in love with a seal woman. It is your people's odyssey, a foundational myth that explains their bond with the unpredictable sea. To recite it is to perform an act of communal memory, except the community is now just you and a man with a machine. The historical accuracy of these tales is, of course, a source of endless debate. Scholars argue whether the events in the epic refer to an actual historical conflict with invaders from across the sea, or if they are purely metaphorical representations of the struggle against nature. You suppose it can be both. Then you move on to the more personal things. You describe your father's hands, the network of scars on them from mending nets. You speak your mother's recipe for a specific type of seaweed broth, a quirky or fringe tidbit of local culinary knowledge, including the instruction to sing a particular sad song while it simmers to give it the right flavor. It seems a bizarre detail, but to you it is simply part of the fabric of memory. The broth doesn't taste right without the song. The idea that future academics might analyze that recipe and write papers on ritualistic culinary incantations strikes you as profoundly funny. For your mother, it wasn't ritual, it was just Tuesday dinner. A joke just for you and the ghosts. You sing for him. A lullaby first, a simple melody with complex, layered lyrics about the stars being the silver buttons on God's coat. Then a lament, a song for a funeral, a tune that feels as gray and raw as the sea in winter. As you sing, you are no longer in the pale sun of the afternoon. You are in a dimly lit room full of mourners. You are by a cradle, rocking a child that isn't yours. The songs are vessels of time. They transport you, and you realize with a sudden, startling clarity that your voice, etched onto that spinning cylinder, will carry those listeners into these moments too. They will feel the sadness of the lament without understanding a single word of why it is sad. Hours pass. Alistair has to change the wax cylinders several times. He labels each one with meticulous care, marking them with a number and a date in his neat, spidery script. A pile of brown, waxen voices begins to accumulate beside him on the grass. Your throat grows sore. The sun begins its slow descent toward the hazy horizon, turning the sky the color of a fading bruise. You are empty. You have poured out stories, songs, recipes, jokes, griefs, and generations of quiet knowledge into the flared brass mouth of the machine. You have spoken to the memory of your entire lineage. Your language, which had been your most private, secret self, is now an artifact. It is catalogued, objectified. You have turned your soul into a collection. As you speak the last words onto the final cylinder, a simple phrase of farewell from the old tongue, the one you say to someone you do not expect to see again, a profound exhaustion settles over you. It is the exhaustion of a long, long journey. You have walked back through your entire life and spoken its name. The last word has been said. Now all that is left is the silence it created. The last cylinder is full. Alistair carefully lifts the stylus, and the faint scraping sound ceases. The sudden silence that descends is different from the silence of your normal day. It is heavier, emptier, as if the air itself, having been filled with the substance of your language for hours, now feels a profound and immediate void. The young linguist packs his machine away with the same reverent care he used to assemble it. The brass horn is nested in its velvet-lined compartment. The precious cylinders, your voice made solid, are carefully placed into felt-lined wooden boxes. He is packing you away. Packing away your history, your parents, your 17 words for shadow. He stands, and for a moment, he looks as exhausted as you feel. He has been a conduit, a vessel for receiving your world, and it has clearly taken its toll. I have no words, he says ironically in his own language. Thank you. This is more than I could have ever hoped for. This will be the most important work of my life. He seems to understand, at least in part, the enormity of what has just transpired. He isn't just taking home data. He's carrying away the last breath of a dying world. You watch him pack. It's a bit like watching a polite and very organized undertaker at work. A joke only you would understand, given the circumstances. He promises that the recordings will be preserved in the university's great archive. He tells you that scholars and students for generations to come will be able to listen to them. They will study the phonology, the grammar, the unique vocabulary. They will hear your voice and marvel at the intricate beauty of the language. Your words will be safe from the devouring fungus he mentioned. They will live on, in a quiet, temperature-controlled room, hundreds of miles away. It is meant to be a comfort, and it is in a way, but it is a cold comfort, like being assured your ghost will have a very nice portrait hanging in a very prestigious gallery. He offers you payment, a handful of coins that feels ridiculously small and slightly insulting. You refuse with a simple shake of your head. This was not a transaction. This was something else entirely. A confession, perhaps. An exorcism. A final, desperate shout into the wind. How can there be a price for that? With a final, heartfelt word of thanks, he shoulders his heavy leather case. He gives you one last, long look, his eyes full of a respectful, scientific pity. Then he turns and walks away down the gravel path, his footsteps crunching with a finality that echoes in the twilight air. You watch him until he is just a small, dark figure shrinking against the vast, darkening landscape, disappearing back into the world of the future, a world that has no room for the language he is carrying in his box. The door to your cottage clicks shut. The silence that greets you now is absolute. It is a deafening, perfect silence, utterly devoid of the echoes that once filled it. Before, the silence was full of the ghosts of your language. But you have given the ghosts away. You sent them away with Alistair. Your head, for the first time in your life, is quiet. The constant, murmuring river of the old tongue has run dry. You try to think a thought in it, but only the words from the new language come to you. It's as if the act of speaking it all, of pouring it all out, has emptied you completely. You sit in your chair as night falls, the room filling with deep blue shadows. You are now truly alone. Before, you were the last speaker. Now you are just the last. The language is no longer a living thing inside you. It is a memory of a performance. This strange state of being touches upon a quirky tidbit of linguistic theory. Some linguists posit the existence of dormant languages, which exist only in written texts or recordings and could, theoretically, be reawakened if taught to a new generation of speakers. Your language is now in that state. It is dormant, sleeping in wax, waiting for a prince who may never come. The mainstream historical fact is that you are not unique. Throughout history, countless languages have flickered out in exactly this way, in a quiet cottage, on a remote coastline, in the mind of a single, aging person. You are one in a long, silent procession of endlings. The last speaker of Etruscan, of Cumbric, of Polabian. Their names are lost to time, but their experience must have been so similar to your own. Did they too feel this profound, hollowing quiet after the last word was spoken? Did a young man with an ink pot and quill ever come to their door? You wonder what will become of Alistair's wax cylinders. His work represents a pivotal moment in preservation, yet historians still debate the ultimate legacy of these first-generation field recordings. Will they become sacred relics, the Rosetta Stones for vanished worlds? Or will they simply become academic footnotes, their waxen grooves slowly smoothed by time, the voices within fading into an unintelligible whisper, their meaning lost to the complexities of history and cultural change? Perhaps someone, a century from now, will find a box labeled with your name and hear your voice singing a lullaby about the stars, and will feel a flicker of connection, a shared humanity across the gulf of time. Or perhaps they will just hear the scratches, the surface noise, and wonder what all the fuss was about. You look at the cat, who is curled up on your lap, purring, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift that has just occurred. The cat is your only companion in this new, silent world. You stroke its soft fur, and you feel the urge to speak to it, to murmur a term of affection. The word that comes to mind is not from the old tongue. It is a simple, common word from the language of the schoolmaster. And for the first time, it does not feel entirely alien on your tongue. It feels quiet. The day ends as it began, in silence. But this is a new silence. A final silence. You are the empty vessel. The library is closed. You get ready for bed, the simple, mechanical motions a small comfort. As you lie under your heavy quilts, you listen to the sound of the wind outside. It is speaking its own ancient language, one that will never be recorded, one that will never die. And in your head, there is at last peace. A vast, lonely, and peaceful quiet. The story is over. The world has been told, and you can finally rest.